I never thought I would sell my pride for a piece of paper, and I definitely did not think I would be counting down the days to escape a woman who had everything. But when you look at your 8-year-old son and realize you cannot afford his dinner, pride is the first thing you pawn. For 118 days, she looked at me like a stain on her marble floors, a hired husband to secure her multi-million-dollar inheritance. 4 months, separate bedrooms, $80,000 at the end. But on day 119, hours before our contract expired, this untouchable CEO stood in my doorway, tears ruining her perfect makeup, and begged me to stay. But before I tell you exactly what broke her, you need to understand how we got there. If you know what it means to sacrifice everything for the people you love, subscribe to the channel, because this story is for you. Let me take you back to the day I lost my garage. My name is Andre. For 15 years, I built a life with my hands, running an independent auto repair shop that I poured my blood and sweat into. I knew every wrench on my pegboard and every rattle in an engine, but knowing cars does not teach you how to outrun a bad economy. The day I had to snap the heavy steel padlock onto the chain-link fence of my shop, the click echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. I stood there staring at the faded sign with my name on it, breathing in the scent of motor oil and defeat, knowing that the real failure was not losing a building. The real failure was knowing I was going to have to go home and look my 8-year-old son, Zion, in the eye, and figure out how to tell him that his father could no longer provide for him. Zion is my entire world, the only piece of light left in my life after his mother walked away when he was just a baby. He is a quiet, perceptive boy who notices everything, and shielding him from our grim reality had become my second full-time job. I did not want him to carry the weight of a grown man's failures, but I was running out of lies to tell. Every parent knows the exact moment their child starts to lose their innocence, and for Zion, it was happening in slow motion right in front of me. That evening, I tried to keep everything normal. I cooked the last of the decent groceries we had, giving Zion a full plate of chicken and rice, while I scraped the burnt edges from the pan into my own bowl, telling him I had eaten a big lunch at the shop. I watched him sit at the small, scratched kitchen table, his feet dangling off the chair, quietly eating without making a sound. He did not ask how work was. He did not ask why I was not eating much. He just kept his eyes on his plate, and that silence terrified me more than any question he could have asked. Kids do not miss the details. They feel the shift in the air when the foundation of their world starts to crack, and Zion was already adjusting his weight to balance the house. I thought I was protecting him by suffering quietly, but I did not realize that my son was already fighting his own silent battle to protect me. I just did not know how far he was willing to go, or the price he was secretly paying every single day. The next few days were a blur of desperate phone calls and closed doors. I visited every garage in the city, asking for work, taking whatever scraps of labor I could find just to keep the lights on in our apartment. I would come home exhausted, my hands blistered and my back aching, only to put on a brave face the moment I walked through the door. I would ask Zion about his day at school, and he would give me these short, cheerful answers that felt perfectly rehearsed. He was too well behaved, too accommodating, never asking for toys or extra snacks like he used to. One afternoon, I found his favorite pair of sneakers with a hole forming near the toe, and when I mentioned we should go buy new ones, he quickly shook his head and insisted he liked them better this way because they made him run faster. It broke my heart. He was shrinking himself to fit into the poverty I had created. He was absorbing my stress like a sponge, trying to be invisible so he would not add to my burden, and I felt entirely powerless to stop it. The truth finally caught up to us on a quiet Friday afternoon. I was cleaning out the small closet in his room, looking for an extra blanket, when I noticed an old battered chocolate milk tin shoved into the back corner, half hidden under a pile of winter sweaters. It felt unnaturally heavy when I picked it up. I pried the rusted lid off, expecting to find marbles or small rocks he liked to collect from the park. Instead, my breath caught in my throat. The tin was stuffed with crinkled $1 bills, quarters, and dimes. There was a piece of lined notebook paper folded at the bottom, with my son's uneven handwriting spelling out "For Dad's shop." I stood there in the dim light of his bedroom, counting the money with trembling hands. $23.45. It took me a moment to realize where it had come from. Zion had not asked for extra money in weeks. He had been keeping his daily lunch allowance, skipping meals at school, pretending he was eating, just so he could build a small fortune to save my failing business. He had found out about the padlock from a classmate. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My 8-year-old boy was going hungry because he thought it was his job to fix my broken life. I carefully placed the tin back exactly where I found it, making sure it looked untouched. Then I walked out of his room, went straight into the small, cramped bathroom, and locked the door behind me. I turned the sink faucet on full blast, letting the hot water rush loudly against the porcelain basin. I sat down on the edge of the cold bathtub, buried my face in my grease-stained hands, and wept. I sobbed with a kind of deep, chest-heaving grief that I had never allowed myself to feel, making sure the running water drowned out the sound so Zion would not hear me breaking apart. A father is supposed to be the wall that keeps the cold wind out, and I had become the draft that was freezing my son. I wiped my face, splashed cold water on my eyes, and promised myself I would do whatever it took, no matter how humiliating, to fix this. But promises do not pay the rent, and the eviction notices were already starting to pile up on the kitchen counter, their bright red letters screaming what I already knew. I spent the next 2 weeks taking odd jobs, moving heavy furniture for cash, fixing neighbors' cars in the street for pennies, trying to scrape together enough to keep the lights on. Every morning, I forced a smile, handed Zion his lunch money, and made him promise he would eat every bite. I watched him walk to the school bus, his small backpack bouncing, knowing that $23 in a tin can was a countdown to disaster. The sheer desperation of poverty is that it strips away your options until you are left staring at doors you swore you would never open. I was reaching the absolute end of my rope. I had sold my tools, my pride, and almost my truck. I needed a miracle, or at least a lifeline, even if it was covered in thorns. I could not sleep, calculating the days we had left before we were forced into a shelter. The weight of that reality was crushing, a constant pressure behind my eyes that never faded, reminding me of my failure. The turning point happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when I least expected it. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a pile of unpaid bills, when a sharp, unexpected knock echoed through the apartment. I opened the front door to find a man in a tailored gray suit standing on my chipped porch, holding a leather briefcase that cost more than my entire life savings. He did not look like a bill collector, and he definitely did not belong in my neighborhood. He introduced himself as an attorney representing a private client and asked if he could step inside. I let him into our cramped living room, offering him a mismatched chair, which he wiped down subtly before sitting. He did not waste time on small talk. He looked around, taking in the water stains on the ceiling and the worn carpet, and then he pulled out a thick, sealed envelope from his briefcase. He looked me dead in the eye and told me he knew everything about my closed garage, my mounting debts, and my desperate situation with Zion. Then the lawyer laid out a proposition that sounded completely insane. He said his client had a highly unconventional opportunity that could solve all my financial problems overnight, provided I was willing to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and suspend my pride for a few months. He did not give me a name or details, just an address and a time for a meeting the following morning. He slid $1,000 in cash across the table as a retainer just to show up. I looked at the money, feeling a deep wave of suspicion and unease. Men in suits do not hand out cash in poor neighborhoods, out of the goodness of their hearts. There was a catch, and I knew it was going to cost me a piece of my dignity. But as I glanced toward Zion's closed bedroom door, remembering the tin can full of lunch money, I knew I did not have the luxury of turning him down. I took the envelope, shook the lawyer's hand, and prepared myself to walk into a world I did not understand, ready to face whatever humiliating terms were waiting for me to save my son. The next morning, I found myself walking into an immaculate, glass-paneled office building downtown, a place where the air felt artificially cold and the floors gleamed like mirrors. The attorney escorted me to the top floor, leaving me in a massive conference room with sweeping views of the city. A few minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened, and Diana Whitmore walked in. She was 37, dressed in a sharp, dark designer suit, her posture rigid and her expression entirely unreadable. She did not extend a hand. She did not offer a polite smile. She simply walked to the head of the glass table, sat down, and looked at me as if I were a piece of defective machinery she was considering buying for spare parts. Her eyes flicked down to my worn, steel-toed work boots, and I could practically hear the calculations happening in her head. Her disdain was not loud or aggressive. It was a quiet, suffocating classism. To her, I was not a person with a life and a son. I was a problem on a spreadsheet, a temporary necessity to be acquired and discarded. Diana slid a thick, 40-page legal document across the pristine glass surface. She spoke with a voice that was perfectly modulated and entirely devoid of warmth, explaining the bizarre reality of her situation. Her late father, a ruthless business mogul, had left a draconian clause in his will. To inherit her position as CEO and take full control of the family empire she had built alongside him, she had to be married and cohabitating for at least 4 months before her 38th birthday. It was a posthumous power play, a final attempt by a controlling patriarch to force his independent daughter into a traditional mold. Diana had no intention of actually sharing her life with anyone. She needed a husband on paper, a ghost who would occupy a room in her mansion, attend a few corporate dinners, and stay entirely out of her way. She had selected me because I was desperate, financially ruined, and unlikely to cause a scandal. I was, in her precise words, an acceptable risk, with no leverage to demand anything beyond the agreed terms. The terms were brutal in their clarity, leaving no room for negotiation. 4 months of legal marriage. We would live in the exact same house, but exist in entirely separate orbits. There would be no unannounced visits to her wing, no loud noises, no interference in her highly structured routine, and absolutely no emotional attachments. In exchange for my compliance, she would pay off the debt on my garage immediately, and at the end of the 120 days, I would receive a final payment of $80,000. It was an astronomical amount of money for me. It was enough to completely reopen my shop, secure a stable home for Zion, and ensure he would never have to skip a meal again. I sat there looking at the contract, feeling the heavy weight of my pride battling against the harsh reality of my son's empty lunchbox. Diana watched me with absolute certainty, her posture relaxed and confident because she knew the outcome. She had the checkbook, which meant she had all the power, and she believed money could buy my dignity. She did not understand that I was not selling my soul to her. I was simply buying my son's future. I picked up the heavy gold pen she provided and signed my name on the dotted line. 3 days later, Zion and I packed our few belongings into cheap trash bags and worn duffels and moved into her sprawling, silent mansion in the hills. The house was a massive fortress of cold stone and minimalist furniture, devoid of color or any sign of actual human warmth. It felt much more like a high-end museum than a place where people actually lived. The head housekeeper showed us to our quarters, a spacious but incredibly sterile suite on the far side of the estate. Zion clutched his small backpack to his chest, his eyes wide, as he took in the vaulted ceilings and the endless, echoing hallways. He did not say much, sensing the heavy transactional nature of the space we were entering. When Diana finally crossed paths with us in the grand foyer that evening, she barely acknowledged my presence, her eyes glued to the screen of her phone as she walked by. But when she briefly looked up and saw Zion standing there in his faded clothes, her expression tightened slightly. She did not smile at him. She offered him a stiff, rehearsed nod, treating him not like a curious child, but like a minor inconvenience she had agreed to tolerate as part of the contract. I immediately pulled Zion a little closer to my side, making a silent, unbreakable promise to myself right then and there. I would shield him from the frost of her world just as fiercely as I had shielded him from the poverty of ours. We quickly settled into a strange, ghostly routine within the massive house. For the first few weeks, Diana and I only interacted when absolutely necessary. She communicated her schedule through brief, typed notes left on the pristine kitchen island or relayed messages through her assistant. We lived under the same roof, breathing the same air, but a thick, invisible wall separated us, built entirely out of her disdain and my stubborn refusal to let her money make me feel inferior or small in any way. When we were forced to attend a public event to satisfy the lawyers monitoring the will, we played our parts perfectly. We smiled for the flashes of the cameras, stood close enough to look like a convincing couple, and answered questions with rehearsed affection. But the moment the heavy doors of the tinted SUV closed behind us, the illusion shattered, and we retreated into our opposite corners in absolute, suffocating silence. It was an exhausting performance, draining my energy day by day. I realized very quickly that the real challenge of this contract would not be the public charades or navigating the complex legal paperwork. The hardest part was going to be surviving the relentless, numbing coldness of her world without letting it freeze the warmth and love I shared with my son. I was a man used to the loud noise of a garage, the smell of grease, and tangible, honest results, and now I was trapped in a sprawling house where human emotions were suppressed and every single interaction felt like a highly calculated business maneuver. As the days dragged into weeks, the isolation of the mansion began to press down on me heavily. I spent my afternoons fixing small, broken things around our wing of the house, trying desperately to keep my hands busy, while Zion sat on the floor doing his homework next to me. I could see the quiet toll the sterile environment was taking on him. His bright laughter was getting quieter, his steps more cautious, as if he was afraid of leaving a mark on the immaculate floors. I knew I had to hold the line, to keep our small corner of this massive estate filled with love and normalcy to counteract the chill. But Diana's icy presence was a constant, looming shadow, a daily reminder that we were nothing more than a purchased solution to a legal problem she could not solve alone. Other men in my desperate position might have broken the rules, demanded more money, or tried to force a connection to make the miserable time pass faster. But I had my own code, and I was not going to compromise it for a woman who viewed me as property. I made a decision that I would not beg for her respect, and I would absolutely not let her extreme wealth intimidate me into feeling less than I was. I would simply outlast her, serving my time like a prison sentence until the contract expired. But as week 6 approached and the novelty of the arrangement wore off, the quiet, rigid tension in the house began to shift into something more volatile. The silent war between her cold control and my quiet defiance was reaching a boiling point. I started to wonder if I could really survive the full 4 months without letting this golden cage completely break my spirit, or worse, damage my son. The stakes were getting higher every single day, and I knew a collision was inevitable. The real question was not if I could finish the contract, but whether I would recognize myself when it was over, and if Diana would ever realize that her money could not control everything. The shared living arrangement slowly morphed into a silent, intense battleground of wills. Zion and I carved out our own existence, refusing to let the mansion's sterile, oppressive atmosphere crush us. I brought in an old broken toaster I found at a thrift store, spending my evenings taking it apart on the granite kitchen island, while Zion happily handed me the screws, and I patiently taught him the names of the tools. We laughed loudly, we played soft soul music on a small radio, and we ate our simple meals together, intentionally filling the dead silence of the house with our own brand of warmth. Diana would occasionally walk past us on her way to her office, her expensive heels clicking sharply on the hardwood, casting icy, disapproving glares in our direction. She expected me to shrink, to immediately apologize for taking up space, to act like a grateful employee who knew his place. Instead, I simply nodded respectfully, wiped the grease from my hands with a rag, and calmly continued my work with Zion without missing a beat. I was not going to let her money or her attitude make me feel small. I could see her profound frustration building with every passing day. She could not understand a man who did not want anything from her, who could not be bought or intimidated with the extreme luxury surrounding him. The first real test of our bizarre arrangement happened during a high-stakes dinner she hosted for her board of directors. It was a crucial evening designed to prove the absolute legitimacy of our marriage to the skeptical, conservative old men who controlled her father's massive trust fund. I was dressed in a tailored, expensive suit she had provided, instructed to play the part of the supportive, quiet husband who stayed out of the way. The dining room was filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and the hum of million-dollar conversations. During dessert, one of the older board members, a man dripping with arrogance and condescension, made a thinly veiled, insulting comment about my blue-collar background. He laughed sharply, suggesting I must be completely overwhelmed by the complexity of their sophisticated corporate world, expecting me to lower my head in shame. Diana instantly stiffened beside me, her jaw tightly clenched, bracing for an embarrassing, explosive scene that she thought would ruin her inheritance. I know what you are thinking, that I flipped the heavy table, raised my voice, or stormed out of the room to defend my honor. I did not do any of that. I calmly set down my silver fork, wiped my mouth with a napkin, and looked the arrogant man dead in the eye. Using a quiet, precise analogy about engine calibration, structural integrity, and the danger of ignoring small fractures, I completely dismantled his argument. I subtly pointed out that a faulty foundation eventually destroys even the most expensive, polished machine, leaving him looking foolish. The entire table fell completely, uncomfortably silent. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of anger. I just delivered the truth with the steady, unshakable confidence of a man who knows his own worth and does not need external validation. The board member flushed a deep red and quickly changed the subject, thoroughly humiliated. I did not look over at Diana for approval, and I did not boast about putting him in his place. I simply picked up my water glass, took a sip, and finished my meal in peace. Later that night, as we walked back to our separate wings of the house, she stopped in the dimly lit hallway. She did not say thank you, because that was not in her vocabulary, but her rigid posture had softened just a fraction, and the way she looked at me had changed. It was not gratitude, it was a reluctant, cautious respect. She realized in that moment that I was not a cheap prop she had rented for a performance. I was a shield she did not know she needed. But that small crack in the ice did not last long, because the very next week, a sudden crisis threw the entire house into chaos, testing the limits of everything we were doing. Zion woke up in the middle of the night with a dangerously high fever and a harsh, rattling cough that sounded like broken glass. The terrible sound echoed through the quiet, empty mansion, sharp and frightening, and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach as I threw off the covers and rushed to his bedside. He was burning up, his small chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. I did not bother calling for the housekeeper, and I certainly did not look for Diana. I went straight into pure survival mode, moving with the fierce, practiced competence that comes from being a single parent who has faced every nightmare alone. I drew a lukewarm bath, held his small, shivering body close to my chest, and murmured softly to calm his panicked breathing, promising him over and over that his dad was right there and everything was going to be okay. I carried him out to the massive kitchen to get children's medicine and a cold towel, pacing the floor as the minutes stretched on. As I sat on the cold tile floor holding my son, applying the damp cloth to his forehead, I looked up and saw Diana standing quietly in the shadows of the hallway. She was wearing a silk robe, her arms crossed tight against her chest as if protecting herself, just watching us. She did not intervene, she did not offer any help, and she did not say a word. But her eyes were completely locked on the way I held Zion, the way I smoothed his damp hair and whispered that he was safe. For the very first time since I met her, she did not look angry, bored, or disdainful. She looked completely lost. She was watching a type of unconditional, fierce, protective love that she had absolutely no idea how to process or understand. In that quiet kitchen, she realized she had all the money in the world, but she had absolutely no idea how to comfort another human being in pain. The terrifying crisis finally passed by early morning, and Zion's fever broke, leaving him exhausted but safely asleep in his bed. I tucked the blankets around him, kissed his forehead, and walked out to the kitchen to make a desperately needed pot of strong black coffee. Diana was sitting silently at the island, staring blankly at an untouched cup of tea. When I walked in, she did not immediately retreat to her office like she usually did to avoid me. She stayed seated, her hands trembling very slightly as she continuously traced the rim of her porcelain cup. We did not speak a single word about what had happened during the night, but the air between us felt fundamentally different. It was the first time she had stayed in a room with me when she did not legally have to. The heavy armor was still there, but the foundation holding it up was starting to rot away. She was beginning to realize that the cold rules of transaction she had built her life upon were utterly useless in the face of genuine, raw, human connection. The balance of power in the house was shifting rapidly, not because I was actively fighting her, but because I was simply refusing to play her game, and she did not know how to handle a man who did not want her money. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the quiet terror of a woman realizing her entire worldview was fundamentally flawed. I could see the deep cracks forming in her heavy armor, but I still did not know what it would take to finally shatter it completely. The days were ticking down fast, and the end of our strict contract was rapidly approaching. What do you think was the final blow that broke her completely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because what happened next surprised even me. It was day 119. Tomorrow morning, the strict contract would officially expire, the $80,000 would finally hit my account, and Zion and I would pack our bags and walk out of her massive, echoing life forever. I had spent the entire morning in my room, quietly organizing my tools and clothes, getting mentally ready to reclaim my old garage and start over. Diana had been unusually quiet and distant, completely avoiding me for the past 2 days, hiding behind the heavy doors of her office. That afternoon, I was outside in the driveway, checking the tire pressure on my worn-out truck, when she finally came looking for me. She had walked straight into my room, a space she had strictly and intentionally avoided for 4 long months, intending to drop off the final termination paperwork and leave immediately. But instead of turning around and walking out, she stopped dead in her tracks. Right there, sitting on the small wooden desk in the corner, was Zion's battered chocolate milk tin. Zion had taken the tin out of his backpack the night before and left it sitting right next to a framed picture of the two of us from when he was a toddler. The rusted lid was slightly off, and the crinkled dollar bills and loose coins were clearly visible inside. But more importantly, the folded, lined notebook paper was resting right on top of the money, with the words, "For Dad's Shop," written in uneven, heavy crayon. When I walked back into the house and approached the room, holding a heavy wrench and wiping grease from my hands with a rag, I froze in the doorway. Diana was standing completely still by the desk, holding the small piece of lined paper in her perfectly manicured hand. Her shoulders were absolutely rigid, and the silence in the room was so thick and heavy it felt hard to breathe. She slowly turned to look at me, and her face was entirely pale, the cold, composed mask of the untouchable CEO completely gone, replaced by genuine shock. She held up the note, her hand trembling visibly, her voice barely a whisper as she asked what this was, why an 8-year-old child was keeping a rusted tin full of spare change and dollar bills in a multi-million-dollar mansion. I could have gotten highly defensive right then. I could have snatched the paper away from her and told her it was absolutely none of her business, protecting my pride and keeping the wall up until the contract ended. But I did not do that. I set the heavy wrench down on the dresser, took a slow, deep breath, and calmly told her the truth. I told her about the devastating day I had to padlock the shop, about Zion secretly skipping his school lunches, and about the $23 he had painfully and quietly saved to fix my broken life. I told her about sitting in the locked bathroom with the water running on full blast so my son would not hear his father breaking down and crying over his own failure. I did not say it to make her feel bad, and I definitely did not say it to ask for her pity. I just delivered the harsh reality of what love actually looked like in our world, without any sugarcoating. As the words settled in the quiet room, I watched Diana Whitmore physically crumble. The heavy, impenetrable armor she had worn every single day just gave way all at once. She dropped the note back onto the desk, covered her mouth with her trembling hand, and let out a quiet, deeply broken sob that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for decades. She backed away until she hit the edge of the bed, slowly sinking down onto the mattress, her perfect posture completely shattered. For a long time, the only sound in the room was her ragged, uneven breathing as she tried to compose herself and failed. I did not step forward to hold her, and I did not offer empty words of comfort to make it stop. I knew she needed the quiet space to feel the massive weight of what she had just realized about herself and the world. Slowly, haltingly, staring at the floor, the hidden story of her life began to pour out of her. She told me about growing up in this massive, beautiful house, raised by a father who treated her like a corporate employee rather than a daughter. She had spent her entire life achieving, building, and dominating every room she walked into, all in a desperate, exhausting attempt to earn a single word of genuine affection from a man who only valued profit margins and flawless execution. She had been taught from a young age that love was a dangerous weakness, a transactional vulnerability that people use to extract money and power. She built her massive walls because it was the only way she knew how to survive the freezing cold of her own family. Looking at that small tin can, seeing what Zion was willing to sacrifice just to see his father smile, she realized the devastating truth. She had spent 37 years being intensely valued for what she owned, for the empire she controlled, but she had never, not once in her entire life, been truly loved for who she actually was. The symmetry of our pain was laid bare in that quiet room, a stark, undeniable contrast between two different kinds of survival. I had lost my business, my financial security, and my pride, but I had a son who would literally starve himself just to protect me. She had a corporate empire, immense power, and millions in the bank, but she was entirely alone in a fortress of her own making, surrounded by people who only wanted her money. We had both been surviving the harshness of life in completely opposite ways. I sat down in the wooden chair across from her, resting my forearms on my knees, and just listened to her unravel completely. I did not judge her for the bitter coldness she had shown me over the past 4 months. Instead, I saw the scared, deeply lonely girl underneath the expensive designer suit, recognizing the immense, exhausting effort it took to keep those emotional walls standing every single day. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes red, her makeup completely ruined, and her perfect posture gone. There was absolutely no disdain left in her expression. There was only a quiet, desperate exhaustion. The powerful CEO who had bought my time had finally realized that the only thing she truly wanted was the one thing her vast fortune could never buy. The silence that followed was not heavy or oppressive, like the tense silence we had shared for the past 4 months. It was fragile and clear, like the air right after a violent storm finally breaks. We sat there in the fading afternoon light, a ruined mechanic and a broken CEO, connected by a sudden, raw understanding of each other's hidden wounds. I knew part of her was still bracing for impact, waiting for me to take advantage of the moment, to demand more money, or to leverage her sudden vulnerability against her. That is exactly how her world worked. But I just reached over, handed her a plain paper tissue from the nightstand, and slowly stood up. I did not make a grand speech or promise to fix her. I simply told her that Zion and I were going to make grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner, and I asked her, in a normal, quiet voice, if she wanted to join us at the table. She did not answer immediately, her hands gripping the tissue tightly, but as I walked out the door and down the hallway, the vast distance between us felt fundamentally altered. The legal contract was officially ending tomorrow morning, but for the very first time, I found myself looking at the walls of that mansion and wondering what would actually happen when the paperwork expired. The morning of day 120 arrived with a heavy, undeniable sense of finality. My phone buzzed loudly on the wooden nightstand, displaying a notification from the bank confirming that the $80,000 had been successfully transferred into my account. The deal was officially done. I had fulfilled my end of the bizarre bargain. Her massive inheritance was permanently secured, and I finally had the money to reclaim my life and reopen my shop. I packed our few bags in complete silence, making absolutely sure we left the guest room exactly as we found it 4 months ago. When Zion and I walked out into the grand foyer, carrying our duffels, Diana was waiting by the front door. She looked exhausted, her posture completely stripped of the rigid, untouchable authority she usually wore like armor. She held out a thick white envelope to me, explaining in a quiet, hesitant voice that it was an extra bonus, a token of appreciation for enduring the past 4 months with her. I know what you are thinking, that I should have just taken the money and walked away. But I looked at the envelope, shook my head, and gently pushed her hand away. I told her I was hired to do a specific job. I got paid exactly what we agreed upon for that job, and my dignity simply was not for sale. I needed her to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that my presence in her life was never about extorting her wealth or taking advantage of her. A brief flash of sheer panic crossed her eyes when I firmly refused the money. Writing a check was the only language she knew how to speak, the only way she knew how to ask someone to stay, and I had just taken that tool away from her completely. I picked up my heavy duffel bag, put my hand firmly on Zion's small shoulder, and turned toward the heavy oak doors to leave. But before I could turn the brass handle and walk out of her life forever, she stepped forward and called my name, her voice cracking in the quiet space, stripping away the last remnants of her pride. She looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes, and admitted the one thing she swore she would never say. She said that the massive house felt too big, that the corporate empire meant absolutely nothing if she had to walk through it entirely alone, and she begged me not to leave. It was not a demanding command from a powerful CEO. It was a desperate plea from a woman who had finally found something real and was terrified of losing it. But it was not my response that sealed our fate in that hallway. It was Zion. Without missing a single beat, without any filter of class, fear, or hesitation, my 8-year-old son dropped his small backpack on the floor, walked right up to this powerful, intimidating woman, grabbed her trembling hand, and asked her if she wanted to come with us to get pancakes to celebrate the new shop opening. Diana looked down at Zion's small hand wrapped tightly around hers, and the final wall collapsed completely. She did not care about the board members, the trust fund, or her father's imposing ghost anymore. She dropped to her knees right there in the foyer, wrapped her arms tightly around my son, and hugged him with a desperate, fierce grip, finally letting herself be anchored by something real. I stood there watching them, a slow, imperfect realization washing over me. We did not suddenly become a flawless, happy family in that single moment. The deep damage of her past and the heavy struggles of mine did not just vanish into thin air because we decided to share a breakfast. We had a long, incredibly difficult road ahead of us, full of arguments, misunderstandings, and learning how to truly trust each other. But as we walked out of that mansion together, hand in hand, the icy air of the estate felt a little warmer. I had walked into that house to save my son's future, but in the process, we ended up saving a woman from her own fortified prison. The truth is, the richest legacy you can possibly leave behind is not a massive corporate empire built on cold contracts, money, and ruthless control. It is a warm home built on the courage and willingness to be truly vulnerable, to show your deepest scars, and to love without any conditions or expiration dates. Which brings me to a question I want you to think about carefully as you go about your day. Have you ever built emotional walls so high to protect yourself from getting hurt that you ended up locking out the only people who actually wanted to come in? Think about that for a moment. Tell me your honest answer in the comments below, because I read every single one of them. If this story moved you, hit the like button if you believe in second chances and the power of vulnerability, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. I will see you in the next story.